A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The cottage was dying, just like everything else Selene touched. Its wooden walls creaking against the autumn wind that howled through the mountains, like a wounded animal searching for shelter it would never find. She'd been squatting in this abandoned place for 2 months now, which was longer than she'd stayed anywhere since the Clearwater pack had cast her out with nothing but a thin cloak and the clothes on her back, telling her that her silver hair was a curse they could no longer afford to harbor within their borders. The fireplace crackled weakly, fed by the last few pieces of wood she'd managed to gather before the temperature had dropped so drastically that venturing outside felt like stepping into the mouth of winter itself. All teeth and no mercy, and Selene stirred the thin rabbit stew in her battered pot while talking to herself because after 2 years of solitude, the sound of her own voice was the only thing that kept her tethered to the reality that she was still alive, still breathing, still somehow surviving in a world that had made it abundantly clear she was not wanted. "Perhaps I should move on soon," she murmured into the empty room, her voice barely louder than the whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls, and she pushed a strand of her long, silver hair behind her ear with fingers that trembled slightly from the cold that had seeped into her bones over the past few days. "Someone might come looking for whoever used to live here, and I can't afford another confrontation." Another pack border crossed accidentally. Another set of wolves looking at me with that mixture of fear and disgust that I've learned to recognize the moment it appears in their eyes. The stew was more water than substance, containing one small rabbit she'd managed to trap that morning, along with some wild roots and the last of the dried herbs she'd foraged weeks ago. But it was food, and food meant survival. And survival was all Selene had left to cling to in this existence that felt more like slowly fading away than actually living. Her appearance had always been her curse, or so everyone had told her for as long as she could remember. And sitting here in the flickering firelight, she caught her reflection in the small, cracked mirror that hung on the wall and saw what they saw. A girl who looked like she'd been touched by the moon goddess herself and marked as something other, something wrong. Her hair cascaded down her back in waves of pure metallic silver, not white like an elder's hair or gray like someone prematurely aged, but true silver that caught the light and gleamed like polished metal, like moonlight given physical form, and her skin was so pale it was almost luminescent in the darkness, making her look ethereal and ghost-like in a way that had made other wolves uncomfortable since the day she was born. Her eyes were storm gray with silver flecks that seemed to shift and change depending on the light, and her frame was small and delicate even for an omega, giving her an appearance that was simultaneously fragile and otherworldly, like something that shouldn't exist in the mortal realm, and perhaps that was why they'd all been so eager to believe she was cursed. The memories crashed over her the way they always did when she let her guard down, and Selene closed her eyes against the sting of tears that threatened to fall as she remembered the night everything had shattered beyond repair. The night when Dane Clearwater had stood before the entire pack during their mate consideration ceremony and publicly rejected her with words that still echoed in her mind 2 years later. "I will not mate with death's messenger," he'd said, his voice carrying across the ceremonial clearing with cruel clarity that ensured every single wolf present heard his denouncement, and he'd looked at her with such open disgust that Selene had felt something inside her chest crack and splinter like ice under pressure. Her silver hair appeared the same night the plague took 30 of our pack members, marking her as an omen, a harbinger of misfortune, and I would rather die unmated than tie myself to whatever curse the moon goddess has placed upon her head. The pack had agreed with him, their silence speaking louder than any words could have, and the Alpha had banished her that very night, giving her 1 hour to gather what few possessions she owned before the Border Patrol would escort her out and ensure she never returned. She'd been 22 years old when they cast her out, and now, at 24, she'd learned that the world was vast and empty and full of places where a person could disappear if they tried hard enough, if they walked far enough, if they made themselves small enough that no one noticed their existence. Celine had become very good at being invisible, at moving through territories without drawing attention, at offering her minor healing skills in exchange for food and shelter, before moving on before anyone could grow comfortable enough with her presence to start asking questions, or worse, to start looking at her with that familiar expression of superstitious fear that always preceded rejection. She'd convinced herself that this was fine, that solitude was safer than connection, that being alone meant never having to see that look of horror in someone's eyes when they realized what she was, what she represented in their minds, a walking omen of death and misfortune wrapped in silver hair and pale skin. The scratching started just as Celine was ladling a small portion of stew into her wooden bowl. And at first, she thought it was just another branch scraping against the cottage walls, because the wind had been picking up steadily over the past hour. But then it came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a sound that made her freeze with the ladle halfway to the bowl. It was whimpering, low and pained, and desperate, the sound of something dying slowly and in agony, and every instinct Celine possessed screamed at her to ignore it, to stay inside where it was relatively safe, to not get involved with whatever was happening on the other side of that door, because getting involved meant risk, and risk meant potential danger. But even as these thoughts raced through her mind, her feet were already carrying her toward the door, because despite everything that had happened to her, despite all the rejection and pain and loneliness that had taught her to protect herself first and care for others never, she still couldn't ignore the sound of suffering, couldn't walk away from something in pain when she had the ability to potentially help. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, and Celine took a deep breath that did nothing to calm the racing of her heart as she slowly pulled the door open, bracing herself against the wind that immediately tried to rip it from her grasp. The sight that greeted her made her breath catch in her throat, and her eyes widen in a mixture of shock and immediate visceral fear that sent ice water flooding through her veins, because collapsed on her doorstep was a wolf, and not just any wolf, but an absolutely massive creature that had to be an alpha based on its sheer size alone. The wolf's fur was a silver-gray color that even in its current state of distress seemed to shimmer in the fading evening light, and Celine found herself staring at it with a strange sense of recognition, because the color was so similar to her own hair that it felt like looking at a reflection of herself transformed into animal form, and the thought unsettled her in ways she couldn't immediately articulate. The wolf was in terrible condition, and Celine's limited healing training immediately cataloged the injuries she could see even in the dim light that spilled from her doorway into the gathering darkness outside. There was a deep gash across its ribs that was still bleeding sluggishly, staining the beautiful silver fur with dark red that looked almost black in the shadows, and its shoulder appeared torn. The muscle damaged in a way that suggested either a fight or a fall, or possibly both, and its legs bore multiple lacerations that spoke of a desperate flight through harsh terrain. But worse than the visible injuries was the condition of the wolf itself, because even through the fur, Celine could see that it was severely malnourished, its ribs too prominent, its frame gaunt in a way that indicated prolonged starvation, and its eyes, those striking silver-blue eyes that looked up at her with an intelligence that was far too aware, far too knowing to belong to any ordinary animal, were glazed with pain and exhaustion and the kind of resignation that came from being too close to death for too long. "Oh no," Selena whispered, and the sound of her own voice seemed to break whatever spell had frozen her in place, and she dropped to her knees beside the wolf without thinking about the danger, without considering that this was clearly an alpha wolf, and alpha wolves were territorial and protective, and potentially deadly even when injured. The wolf made no move to attack her, didn't even growl or show its teeth, just continued to watch her with those remarkable eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. And Celine felt something strange flutter in her chest. Something that felt almost like recognition, like her very being was responding to this creature's presence in a way that defied logic or reason. "You're dying," she said softly, reaching out with one pale hand to gently touch the wolf's fur, and the texture was softer than she'd expected, like silk beneath her fingertips, and the wolf made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement, or might have been simply the last reserves of its strength failing. "You shouldn't be here, and I shouldn't help you because you're an alpha, and I'm nobody, and this could get me killed. But I can't just leave you out here to freeze to death in the darkness." The decision made itself in that moment, the way important decisions often do when faced with impossible choices that have no good answers, and Celine slipped her arms under the wolf's front legs and began the arduous, exhausting process of dragging it into her cottage. The wolf was impossibly heavy, all muscle and bone and dead weight that her small frame was never meant to handle. And by the time she'd managed to pull it fully inside and close the door against the wind that had picked up to nearly gale force, Celine was gasping for breath and her arms were trembling with exhaustion, and her back ached from the strain. She positioned the wolf as close to the fireplace as she dared without risking burning it, and then she grabbed her only blanket, the thin, threadbare thing that had been keeping her warm at night, and draped it over the shivering creature that looked even larger now that it was inside the small confines of her cottage, taking up nearly a quarter of the available floor space. "I need to assess your injuries," Celine murmured, falling back into the clinical tone she'd learned from the pack healers who'd trained her before she'd been cast out, before her gift for healing had been deemed less valuable than the supposed curse of her appearance, and she began carefully examining the wolf's wounds with hands that were surprisingly steady despite the fear and adrenaline coursing through her system. The gash across the ribs was deep but clean, suggesting a blade rather than claws, which meant this wolf had been in a fight with other shifters rather than wild animals, and that knowledge made Celine's stomach clench with anxiety, because wolves who fought other wolves were usually involved in pack politics or territorial disputes, and either of those things could mean danger for her if anyone came looking for this creature. The shoulder wound was worse, the muscle torn in a way that would take weeks to heal properly, even with shifter regeneration, and the lacerations on the legs were numerous enough that Celine lost count after the first dozen, each one a testament to whatever desperate flight had brought this wolf to her doorstep. But it was the signs of starvation that concerned her most, because wounds could be treated and injuries could heal, but a body that had been deprived of sustenance for too long struggled to repair itself, and this wolf looked like it hadn't had a proper meal in days, possibly weeks. "You need food," Celine said, glancing over at her pot of stew that was still sitting by the fire, the steam rising from it in lazy spirals that filled the cottage with the savory scent of cooked meat and herbs, and she looked back at the wolf whose eyes were tracking her movements with that unsettling intelligence. "I don't have much, but you need it more than I do right now. And besides, what's one more night of going hungry in the grand scheme of things?" The laugh that escaped her throat was bitter and harsh, and she stood up and walked over to retrieve the pot, bringing it back to where the wolf lay and kneeling beside it once more. The wolf was too weak to lift its head, too exhausted to do anything but lie there and breathe in shallow, pained gasps that made Celine's heart ache with sympathy she didn't want to feel, and she carefully scooped some of the stew into her wooden bowl before setting the pot aside and dipping her fingers into the warm liquid. "I'm going to try to feed you," she explained, her voice soft and soothing in the way she'd learned to speak to frightened animals and injured creatures, and she brought her stew-covered fingers to the wolf's mouth, gently pressing against its lips until they parted and she could slip the food inside. The wolf swallowed reflexively, its eyes closing briefly, as if the taste of food after so long without was almost overwhelming, and Celine repeated the process over and over, patiently feeding the enormous creature one small portion at a time, while her own stomach growled in protest at the smell of food she wasn't eating. "I know what it's like to be starving," Celine found herself saying, the words spilling out of her the way they always did when she was alone and vulnerable and tired enough that her carefully constructed walls began to crumble. "Not just for food, though I've certainly experienced that often enough over the past 2 years, but starving for kindness, for connection, for someone to look at you and not immediately decide that you're wrong somehow, that you're cursed or marked or too different to deserve basic compassion." She continued feeding the wolf, her movements mechanical and practiced, and she felt tears starting to gather in her eyes because this was pathetic, wasn't it? Sitting here in an abandoned cottage, feeding a dying wolf while confessing her loneliness to a creature that couldn't possibly understand or care about the pain that had been her constant companion since the day she was born, different. "Maybe the moon goddess sent you to me for a reason," she whispered, and the wolf's eyes opened again, fixing on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Maybe I'm supposed to save something beautiful for once, instead of being blamed for everything that dies around me, instead of watching the world reject me over and over while I slowly disappear into nothing." She fed the wolf until it wouldn't take any more, until its eyes began to droop with exhaustion and the immediate danger of starvation had been temporarily held at bay. And then Celine set the bowl aside and realized with a start that she'd given the creature her entire dinner, that there was nothing left for her except the knowledge that she'd potentially saved a life tonight. The thought should have made her feel noble or good, or at least satisfied, but instead, she just felt tired, bone-deep exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue and touched something fundamental in her soul. And she looked at the wolf lying on her blanket by her fire in her cottage and wondered what she'd gotten herself into, what consequences this act of compassion would bring down upon her head. The wolf's breathing had evened out, becoming deeper and more regular, and Celine carefully checked its wounds one more time before standing up and moving to the small trunk where she kept her meager supplies, pulling out strips of cloth that had once been a dress and bringing them back to bind the worst of the injuries. As she worked, carefully wrapping the gash on the wolf's ribs and doing her best to stabilize the damaged shoulder, Celine kept talking because the silence felt too heavy, too full of the reality of what she'd done and what it might mean. "You're probably someone important, aren't you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper as her fingers moved with practiced efficiency over silver fur that was matted with blood and dirt and the evidence of trauma. "Wolves your size don't just wander alone through neutral territory unless something has gone very wrong, unless they're running from something, or towards something, or maybe both, and I've just involved myself in your story without knowing anything about the danger I might be inviting into my life." The wolf made no response beyond a slight twitch of its ear, already drifting toward sleep or unconsciousness. Celine couldn't tell which, and she finished her rough bandaging before sitting back on her heels and studying the creature that had invaded her solitude and her space, and possibly her safety. The fire was burning low, and Selene added the last of her wood before realizing that she'd need to venture out in the morning to gather more if she wanted to keep them both warm through what promised to be a brutal autumn night. And the thought of leaving this injured wolf alone in her cottage while she foraged made anxiety spike through her chest. But for now, there was nothing more she could do except wait and hope that the wolf would survive the night, that the food and warmth and basic medical care would be enough to pull it back from the edge of death. It had been teetering on when it collapsed on her doorstep, and Celine found herself moving closer to the wolf, drawn by something she couldn't name. Something that felt like instinct or fate, or perhaps just the desperate need for connection that she'd been denying for 2 years. She settled down beside the enormous creature, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from its body despite the injuries and the starvation. And she reached out to rest one pale hand against its silver fur, feeling the steady rhythm of its heartbeat beneath her palm. "I hope you live," Celine whispered into the darkness of her cottage, with the wind howling outside and the fire crackling beside them, and the wolf's breathing steady and deep as it fought to survive through the night. "I hope when you're better, you'll stay for a little while before you go back to wherever you came from, back to whatever pack or family or life you left behind, because it's been so desperately long since anyone wanted to be near me, since anyone looked at me without fear or disgust or pity. And even though you're just a wolf and you don't understand anything I'm saying, having you here makes this cottage feel less like a prison and more like maybe, just maybe, something that could almost be called a home." The tears came then, hot and unexpected, sliding down her pale cheeks while she stroked the wolf's fur and felt the loneliness that had been her constant companion for 2 years crash over her in waves that threatened to drown her, and she curled up beside the massive creature, seeking warmth and comfort from an animal that might not even survive until morning, seeking connection from the only living thing that hadn't immediately rejected her for the crime of being born different. As Selene drifted toward an exhausted sleep, with one hand still resting on the wolf's side and her silver hair mixing with its silver fur until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began, she had no way of knowing that the wolf was still awake, still aware, still watching her with those intelligent, silver blue eyes that held far more understanding than any animal should possess. And she had no way of knowing that in saving this creature's life, she'd just set in motion a chain of events that would shatter her lonely existence and transform her from a rejected, wandering omega into something she'd never dared to dream she could become. But that revelation would have to wait for the morning light, for the days of growing connection that would follow, for the moment when the wolf would finally reveal its true nature and Celine would discover that sometimes the moon goddess works in ways that are mysterious and perfect and utterly terrifying all at once. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the cottage walls like accusatory fingers pointing at Celine's guilt and exhaustion, and she woke with a start to find herself still curled against the massive wolf, whose breathing had grown stronger through the night, whose body temperature had stabilized from the dangerously low levels it had been at when she'd first dragged the creature inside, and whose silver blue eyes were already open and watching her with an intensity that made her heart stutter in her chest before she could fully remember where she was or why she was lying on the floor instead of in her small, uncomfortable bed. The wolf was alive, miraculously and undeniably alive, and Celine felt a rush of relief, so powerful. It nearly brought fresh tears to her eyes as she carefully extracted herself from the position she'd fallen asleep in. Her body, protesting the movement with aches and pains that came from spending the night on hard wooden floors without proper padding or warmth. And she sat up slowly, while keeping her hand on the wolf's side, because some part of her needed the physical confirmation that this creature was real and breathing and hadn't died in the night the way everything else in her life seemed to eventually die or disappear. "You made it through the night," Celine whispered, her voice rough from sleep and emotion, and she ran her fingers through her long silver hair in an attempt to tame it into something less wild, before realizing that the wolf probably didn't care what she looked like. That vanity was a luxury she'd abandoned somewhere in the 2 years of wandering and rejection that had brought her to this moment. The wolf made a soft, chuffing sound that might have been acknowledgement, and it tried to lift its head before the effort proved too much, and it settled back down with what Celine could have sworn was a frustrated huff, and she found herself smiling despite the gravity of their situation, because there was something almost endearing about watching this enormous predator struggle with its own weakness, something that made it seem less threatening and more vulnerable in a way that resonated with her own experience of being reduced to dependency by circumstances beyond her control. "Don't try to move too much yet," she said, checking the makeshift bandages she'd applied the night before, and finding them mostly intact, though stained with blood that had seeped through the cloth during the night. "Your wounds need time to heal, and your body needs to recover from whatever ordeal brought you to my doorstep in such a terrible condition." The reality of her situation crashed over Celine as she looked around her cottage and realized that she'd given the wolf her entire dinner the night before, that her pot contained nothing but the remnants of broth that had cooled and congealed overnight, and that her stomach was cramping with hunger pangs that she'd been ignoring for so long they'd become almost background noise to her existence. She needed to find food, needed to forage or hunt or do something to ensure that both she and this unexpected guest would survive another day. But the thought of leaving the cottage and venturing out into the cold autumn morning filled her with a dread that had nothing to do with the weather, and everything to do with the fact that she'd grown accustomed to her isolation, to the safety of walls between herself and a world that had made it abundantly clear she wasn't welcome. But survival demanded action, and Celine forced herself to stand on legs that felt unsteady and weak, and she moved to the small trunk where she kept her foraging supplies, pulling out a worn basket and the thin cloak that did almost nothing to protect against the cold, but was better than nothing at all. "I have to go find food," she explained to the wolf, who was tracking her movements with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes, and she felt ridiculous for explaining herself to an animal, but the alternative was silence, and silence meant being alone with her thoughts, and her thoughts were not kind companions at the best of times. "I'll be back as soon as I can, and I'll bring whatever I can find, though I have to warn you that my hunting and foraging skills are mediocre at best, learned from necessity rather than any natural talent, and this time of year makes finding anything substantial increasingly difficult with each passing day." The wolf made another sound, this one almost like a whine, and Celine found herself crossing back to it and kneeling down to run her hand over its head in what she hoped was a comforting gesture, though she had no idea if wolves found such contact soothing or merely tolerated it out of weakness. "I promise I'll come back," she said softly, and the words felt like an oath, like something binding and important, even though she was speaking to a creature that couldn't possibly understand the weight of promises or the way they'd been broken in her life over and over, until she'd stopped believing in them entirely. The forest was cold and unwelcoming in the gray morning light, and Celine wrapped her thin cloak tighter around herself as she ventured away from the cottage, following the familiar paths she'd discovered during her 2 months of squatting in this abandoned place. Paths that led to berry bushes that were mostly picked clean by now, and root vegetables that grew wild if you knew where to look, and streams where fish sometimes gathered in pools that were shallow enough to catch them if you were patient and desperate enough to stand in freezing water for hours. She found almost nothing during the first hour of searching, her basket remaining stubbornly empty except for a handful of withered berries that were more pit than fruit, and some roots that looked questionable at best. And the frustration that built in her chest was compounded by the gnawing hunger that made her hands shake and her vision occasionally blur at the edges. This was what her life had become, she thought, bitterly, as she knelt by a stream and plunged her hands into water so cold it felt like knives against her skin. This endless cycle of barely surviving, of scraping together just enough to make it through another day without quite giving up entirely, of existing in the spaces between packs and territories where no one cared enough to drive her away, but no one welcomed her either. By the time the sun had climbed to its midday position, Celine had managed to catch 2 small fish that were barely worth the effort it had taken to trap them, and she'd found a few more edible roots and a cluster of mushrooms that she was reasonably certain weren't poisonous, and she decided that this meager haul would have to be enough, because she'd been gone for hours, and the thought of the wolf lying alone and injured in her cottage made anxiety spike through her chest in a way that felt disproportionate to the situation. She hurried back through the forest, her feet knowing the path by instinct now, and she was breathing hard by the time she pushed open the cottage door and stepped inside to find the wolf exactly where she'd left it, though its eyes had been fixed on the door as if it had been watching and waiting for her return. And something about that focused attention made Celine's breath catch in her throat for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. "I'm back," she announced unnecessarily, setting her basket down by the fire and kneeling to check on the wolf's condition, running her hands over its bandages and noting with relief that the bleeding seemed to have stopped completely, that the wounds were beginning to show the first signs of the accelerated healing that came with shifter biology. Preparing the food took longer than Celine would have liked, because her hands were still numb from the cold stream, and her movements were clumsy with exhaustion and hunger. But eventually, she had a thin soup simmering over the fire, the scent of cooked fish and roots filling the cottage with a warmth that was more psychological than physical. She watched the soup cook while sitting beside the wolf, and she found herself talking again because the silence felt oppressive and wrong, and the wolf seemed to respond to her voice, its ears perking up and its attention focusing on her face in a way that made her feel seen for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I used to dream about having someone to talk to," Celine said, stirring the soup with a wooden spoon that had seen better days, and her voice was soft and contemplative in the dim light of the cottage. "When I was younger, before the rejection and the banishment, I used to imagine that someone would look past my appearance and see me, really see me, and they'd want to know my thoughts and my dreams and all the things I kept locked inside because no one ever asked, because everyone was too busy deciding what I was based on how I looked, rather than who I actually was beneath the silver hair and pale skin that marked me as other." The soup was ready, and Celine went through the same process as the night before, carefully feeding the wolf small portions at a time while her own stomach growled in protest, and she tried to ignore the way her hands trembled slightly from hunger and exhaustion, because the wolf needed the food more than she did, needed the nourishment to fuel its healing. and she would be fine with whatever remained after the creature had eaten its fill. But the wolf seemed to sense her struggle, and after several mouthfuls, it turned its head away and made a sound that was almost like a growl of insistence. And when Celine tried to bring more food to its mouth, the wolf actually nudged the bowl toward her with its nose, and the gesture was so deliberate and so clearly communicative that Celine found herself staring in shock. "You want me to eat?" she asked, feeling foolish for questioning the intentions of an animal. But the wolf's eyes met hers with an expression that was unmistakably affirmative, and something warm and unexpected bloomed in Celine's chest as she lifted a spoonful of soup to her own lips and tasted the thin, barely adequate broth that was nevertheless the most delicious thing she'd eaten in days, simply because something, had cared enough to insist she nourish herself. They shared the meal in a pattern that felt almost ritualistic, Celine feeding the wolf several spoonfuls before taking one for herself. Back and forth until the pot was empty, and both of them had at least something in their stomachs. And the entire time, Celine couldn't shake the feeling that there was something profoundly significant about this sharing of resources, about this unspoken agreement between a rejected omega and a wounded wolf that they would take care of each other, even though logic and self-preservation suggested they should prioritize themselves. "You're different from any wolf I've ever encountered," Celine said as she cleaned the pot and settled back down beside her unexpected companion, and she reached out to stroke the soft, silver fur that was slowly regaining some of its luster as the wolf's condition improved. "Most animals, most wolves, they'd take everything offered and think nothing of the one doing the offering. But you noticed I was hungry, and you cared enough to make me eat even when you need the food just as desperately. And I don't know what to make of that, except to think that maybe you understand loneliness the way I do. Maybe you know what it's like to be abandoned or rejected or cast out from wherever you belonged." The days blurred together after that first morning, and Celine fell into a routine that revolved entirely around the wolf's care and recovery, venturing out each day to forage for food that she would bring back and share, cleaning and changing bandages while talking endlessly about everything and nothing, her past and her fears and her secret dreams that she'd never spoken aloud before, because there had never been anyone to listen. The wolf grew stronger with each passing day, able to lift its head more easily and eventually able to sit up for short periods, and Celine watched its progress with a mixture of joy and growing dread, because she knew that eventually the creature would be well enough to leave, and the thought of returning to her solitude after these days of companionship felt unbearable in a way that terrified her with its intensity. On the third day, Celine told the wolf about Dane's rejection while she was rebandaging the shoulder wound that was healing remarkably well, and the words poured out of her like poison she'd been holding inside for too long. All the pain and humiliation and self-doubt that had festered in the 2 years since that terrible night. "He said I was death's messenger," she whispered, her fingers gentle on the wolf's fur, even as her voice shook with suppressed emotion. "He said my silver hair marked me as cursed, that I'd brought the plague that killed 30 pack members, even though I was only 6 years old when it happened, even though I had nothing to do with the illness that swept through our territory. But they needed someone to blame, and I was convenient, wasn't I, with my strange appearance and my dead parents and my inability to be anything other than what I am." The wolf made a low sound in its chest that might have been a growl of anger, and it turned its head to look at Celine with eyes that held such clear intelligence and understanding that she felt her breath catch in her throat, and before she could stop herself, she was crying, tears streaming down her pale cheeks while she continued to work on the bandages with hands that had learned to function even when her heart was breaking. "I'm sorry," she gasped out, trying to wipe away the tears even as more fell to replace them. I shouldn't be burdening you with this, shouldn't be using you as a confessional for all my pathetic grievances about a life I can't change and a past I can't escape. But you're the first living thing in 2 years that hasn't looked at me with fear or disgust, and I think I've been holding all of this inside for so long that it was going to come out eventually. And better it comes out here in this cottage with only you to witness it than out in the world where it could be used against me as further proof that I'm broken and wrong and unworthy of basic kindness. On the fourth day, Celine collapsed while foraging, her body finally giving out after days of inadequate nutrition and exhaustion, and the physical strain of caring for a creature that weighed more than 3 times what she did. And she came to lying on the forest floor with no clear memory of how much time had passed, only the vague awareness that the sun had moved significantly across the sky, and that she needed to get back to the cottage before dark fell and the temperature dropped even further. She managed to pull herself upright through sheer force of will, and she stumbled back to the cottage with an empty basket because she'd found nothing before her collapse and had no energy left to continue searching. And when she pushed open the door, she found the wolf watching her with what she could only describe as alarm in those silver blue eyes. "I'm fine," Celine said automatically, though the words were clearly a lie given the way she swayed on her feet and had to catch herself against the doorframe to keep from falling. And the wolf made a distressed sound that cut through her haze of exhaustion and made her feel guilty for causing concern in a creature that had its own recovery to worry about. That night, Celine lay beside the wolf with no food in her stomach and no energy left to pretend that she was handling this situation with any kind of grace or competence, and she found herself confessing things she'd never admitted even to herself, truths that had lived in the darkest corners of her heart where she'd hidden them away because acknowledging them felt too dangerous, too much like admitting defeat. "I don't want you to leave," she whispered into the darkness, her hand resting on the wolf's side where she could feel its strong, steady heartbeat beneath her palm. And the admission felt like tearing open a wound that had never properly healed. "I know you'll have to go eventually. Know you'll get strong enough to return to wherever you came from and whatever life you left behind. But these days with you have been the happiest I've had in years, and that's pathetic, isn't it? That the best days of my life in recent memory are the ones I've spent in an abandoned cottage sharing scraps of food with a wolf who probably doesn't even understand half of what I'm saying." The wolf shifted position, moving closer until its body was pressed against hers, sharing warmth in the cold cottage, and Celine felt tears sliding down her cheeks again as she continued speaking words that felt like they were being pulled from her soul. "I thought I was cursed, thought I was marked by death and destined to bring misfortune to everyone around me. And maybe I am. Maybe you'll recover and leave, and something terrible will happen to you because of the time you spent here with me. But I can't bring myself to regret helping you. Can't bring myself to wish I'd left you outside to die. Because for these few days, I've felt less alone than I have in my entire life. And that has to count for something, even if it's temporary and fleeting and ultimately meaningless in the grand scheme of things." The 5th day dawned gray and cold, and Celine woke to find the wolf watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, as if the creature was trying to communicate something important, but lacked the means to express it. And when she checked its wounds, she found them healing with a speed that suggested the wolf would be strong enough to leave within a day or 2 at most. The knowledge should have made her happy, should have filled her with relief that her efforts had succeeded in saving this magnificent creature's life. But instead, she felt a grief so profound it nearly paralyzed her, and she had to force herself to go through the motions of the day, to venture out and forage for food she could barely bring herself to care about, to return and tend to bandages that would soon be unnecessary, to talk to the wolf with a cheerfulness she didn't feel, while her heart cracked further with each passing hour. That afternoon, while Celine was changing the last of the bandages and trying not to think about what tomorrow might bring, the wolf suddenly stood up for the first time since it had arrived. And though it swayed slightly and its movements were stiff with residual pain, it was clearly mobile again, clearly capable of leaving if it chose to. "You're strong enough to go now," Celine heard herself say, and her voice sounded hollow and distant to her own ears, as if someone else was speaking through her mouth while her consciousness watched from somewhere far away. "You should probably leave while the weather is still manageable, should get back to your pack or your territory, or wherever you need to be before winter truly sets in and travel becomes impossible." The wolf moved toward the door with slow, deliberate steps, and Celine felt something inside her chest shatter completely as she stood and walked past the creature to open the door for it, to facilitate its departure, even though every fiber of her being was screaming at her to beg it to stay, to keep this one source of companionship and connection. Even though she knew it was impossible, knew that wolves belonged in packs and wild places, not in abandoned cottages with cursed omegas who talked too much and cried too easily. The wolf paused in the doorway, turning to look back at her with eyes that seemed to hold an entire conversation, and Celine managed a smile that felt like it was breaking her face. "Thank you for letting me help you," she whispered, and tears were already streaming down her face, though she was trying desperately to hold them back. "Thank you for keeping me company these past 5 days, for listening to all my pathetic confessions, and not judging me for being weak and lonely and desperate for any scrap of connection. And I hope wherever you're going, that you'll be safe and happy, and that you'll forget about the strange, silver-haired girl who fed you in her cottage, because remembering me will probably just remind you of pain and suffering and things you'd rather leave behind." The wolf stared at her for a long moment that felt like it stretched into eternity, and then it turned and ran into the forest, its silver-gray fur disappearing into the trees with a speed that suggested its recovery was more complete than Celine had realized. And she stood in the doorway watching the space where it had vanished until the cold forced her back inside. And then she collapsed against the closed door and sobbed with an intensity that would have embarrassed her if there had been anyone present to witness it. The cottage felt emptier than it ever had before, and Celine couldn't bring herself to move from her position against the door, couldn't find the energy or the will to do anything except cry and remember the feel of soft silver fur beneath her hands and the weight of intelligent silver-blue eyes watching her like she mattered, like she was worth seeing. And she knew with absolute certainty that the loneliness that had been her constant companion for 2 years was going to be unbearable now that she'd experienced even a brief respite from it, now that she knew what it felt like to not be entirely alone, even if that connection had been with a creature that couldn't speak or make promises or offer anything beyond temporary companionship. That evening, Celine sat by the dying fire with no motivation to add wood or prepare food or do any of the things necessary for survival, and she was seriously contemplating whether there was any point in continuing this exhausting existence when she heard sounds outside that made her freeze with terror. Sounds that were distinctly not natural, sounds of multiple footsteps and metal clanking, and voices speaking in low, authoritative tones that suggested organization and purpose. Her first thought was that she'd been discovered by whatever pack controlled this territory, that she was about to be punished for trespassing or worse, and she scrambled to her feet with her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, trying to decide whether to hide or run, or simply accept whatever punishment was coming. And then there was a knock on the door, firm and commanding, nothing like the desperate scratching that had heralded the wolf's arrival 5 days earlier. Celine's hands were shaking as she reached for the door handle, and every instinct she possessed was screaming at her not to open it, to barricade herself inside, and hope whoever was out there would eventually leave. But she'd never been particularly good at self-preservation, had always chosen compassion over caution, even when it hurt her. And so she pulled the door open with trembling hands and found herself confronted by a sight that made her mind go completely blank with shock and confusion, and something that might have been hope if she'd dared to let herself feel it. There were warriors standing in formation outside her cottage, at least 20 of them that she could see in the fading evening light, all wearing matching armor of silver and white that marked them as elite guards from one of the great packs. And they were arranged in precise military formation that spoke of training and discipline and power. And standing at the front of this intimidating group was a man who made Celine's breath stop in her lungs, because he was tall and powerfully built, with a presence that radiated alpha authority so strongly she could feel it like a physical pressure against her skin. And his hair was long and silver, falling to his shoulders in waves that were the exact same shade as her own. And when he looked at her with eyes that were silver blue and impossibly familiar, Celine felt the world tilt sideways as recognition crashed over her like a wave, and she heard herself make a small, disbelieving sound as her knees buckled, and she had to grab the doorframe to keep from falling, because this couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. The wolf couldn't have been. He couldn't be. But there was no mistaking those eyes. No mistaking the way he was looking at her with an expression that held wonder and recognition, and something that looked almost like reverence. And then he spoke, his voice deep and resonant and filled with an emotion that Celine couldn't name. And he said words that shattered her understanding of everything that had happened over the past 5 days. "You," he said, and the single word carried the weight of kingdoms, and Selena watched in complete shock as this powerful alpha male took a step closer, while his guards remained at attention behind him, and his silver blue eyes never left her face as he continued speaking. "You're the one who saved me, the woman who fed a starving wolf and asked for nothing in return, and I came back for you because you're mine. Because the mate bond snapped into place the moment you touched me 5 days ago, and I've spent every hour since I left trying to find my way back to this cottage and to you, and now here you are, standing before me looking terrified and confused, and so beautiful it hurts to look at you. And I need you to know that I heard everything you said during those 5 days, every word, every confession, every prayer you whispered into the darkness. And you're not cursed, Celine. You're not death's messenger or a harbinger of misfortune. You're my mate, my true mate. The Luna, the moon goddess created specifically for me. And I'm King Theron of the Silverwood dynasty. And I came back with an army not to frighten you, but to show you that you're not alone anymore, that you're valued and wanted and precious beyond measure. And I'm asking you, begging you, to give me the chance to prove to you that everything you've been told about yourself is a lie, that you're not cursed but blessed, not rejected but chosen, not worthless but invaluable. And I know this is overwhelming and impossible, and probably the last thing you expected when you opened your door tonight. But please, please don't run. Please give me a chance to show you what you mean to me, what you could mean to my kingdom, what we could build together if you're brave enough to take this leap of faith with a man who's been searching for you his entire life without knowing your name or your face, but recognizing your soul the moment you knelt beside him in his darkest hour. The world had narrowed to a single point of impossible reality, and Celine stood frozen in the doorway of her cottage while her mind tried desperately to process the words that King Theron had just spoken. Words that seemed to rewrite everything she'd believed about herself and her place in the world. And she could feel her legs trembling beneath her as the weight of his revelation pressed down on her consciousness like a physical force. Her mate, he'd called her his mate, and the wolf she'd fed and cared for and confessed her deepest secrets to had been not just any alpha, but a king. And he'd heard everything, every pathetic word about her loneliness and her rejection and her desperate hunger for connection. And the humiliation of that knowledge warred with something else in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. But she'd learned not to trust hope, because hope was the thing that hurt most when it was inevitably crushed. "I don't understand," Celine finally managed to whisper, and her voice sounded small and broken even to her own ears. And she wrapped her arms around herself in a gesture that was part self-protection and part attempt to physically hold herself together as everything she'd thought she knew crumbled into dust around her. "You're a king, and I'm nobody. I'm the cursed girl that no pack wanted, the Omega with silver hair that everyone said was a mark of death. And this can't be real. This has to be some kind of mistake or cruel joke because people like you don't come back for people like me." Theron took another step closer, and Celine could see the way his hands were trembling slightly, as if he was fighting the urge to reach for her, to close the distance between them and pull her into his arms. But he held himself back with visible effort, respecting the space she clearly needed, even though every line of his powerful body spoke of desperate restraint. "It's not a mistake," he said, and his voice was gentle despite its natural depth and authority. And there was something in his silver blue eyes that made Celine's breath catch because she'd seen that expression before. Had seen it in the wolf's gaze when it had watched her with such focused intensity, and the recognition of that continuity between the wounded animal she'd saved and this magnificent king standing before her made something crack open in her chest. The mate bond doesn't make mistakes, and the moon goddess marked us both so we'd recognize each other when the time was right. Look at your hair and mine. Look at how perfectly we match. And that's not coincidence. That's destiny. That's the universe itself declaring that you belong with me and I belong with you. And everything you've been through, all the rejection and pain and loneliness, it was all leading you to that moment 5 days ago when you opened your door and found me dying on your doorstep and chose compassion over fear. The guards behind Theron remained perfectly still and silent, but Celine could feel their eyes on her, could sense their curiosity and perhaps their judgment, and the old, familiar shame rose up in her throat like bile because she was standing here in her threadbare dress, with her silver hair tangled and unwashed, living in a cottage that wasn't even hers, possessing nothing of value except the kindness she'd shown to a stranger. And surely these elite warriors were looking at her and wondering why their powerful king would claim someone so clearly beneath his station. "Your guards," Celine said, her voice barely audible, and she couldn't bring herself to meet Theron's eyes anymore, so she focused on a point somewhere past his shoulder. "They must think I'm pathetic. They must be wondering why you'd waste your time on someone like me when you could have anyone, any beautiful Omega from any great pack, someone worthy of being a queen instead of a homeless wanderer who talks to wolves because she has no one else." One of the guards stepped forward, a gruff-looking veteran with scars on his face and silver threading through his dark hair, and he dropped to one knee in the mud outside her cottage, and his action was followed immediately by every other warrior present. 20 elite guards kneeling before her cottage like she was already their Luna, like she was someone worthy of such respect, and Celine felt tears burning in her eyes as the veteran spoke in a voice that was rough but sincere. "My lady," he said, and the title felt wrong applied to her, but he continued before she could protest. "Every warrior here volunteered for this mission, volunteered to search for the woman who saved our king's life when he was at his most vulnerable. And we've been briefed on what you did, how you gave him your only food, how you stayed awake to tend his wounds, how you starved yourself to ensure his survival, and that kind of selfless compassion is exactly what a true Luna embodies, exactly what a queen should be, and any one of us would be honored to serve you, to protect you, to follow you into battle or peace, or whatever the future holds, because you've already proven your worth in ways that matter far more than bloodlines or pack politics or any of the superficial measures that people usually use to judge value." The other guards murmured their agreement, and Celine felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble as she looked at these powerful warriors kneeling in the mud for her. For the girl who'd been told her entire life that she was cursed and worthless and undeserving of basic kindness. And she didn't know what to do with this reversal of everything she'd been taught to believe about herself. Theron was watching her with an expression of such open vulnerability that it made her chest ache, and she realized that he was genuinely afraid she would reject him, that despite being a king with an army at his back, he was standing before her with his heart exposed, waiting for her to decide whether to accept or destroy him with her answer. "I heard everything you said during those 5 days," Theron repeated, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Now," and Celine watched as he seemed to struggle with words that clearly mattered more than anything he'd ever said before. "I heard you talk about Dane's rejection, about how he called you Death's messenger, about the plague that took 30 pack members when you were just a child. And I need you to understand something crucial, Celine. That plague had nothing to do with you. You were a child, an innocent child who happened to be born different, and desperate, grieving people needed someone to blame for their loss, and you were convenient. But correlation is not causation. Your silver hair didn't cause that plague any more than my silver hair causes the rain to fall or the sun to rise." Celine wanted to believe him, wanted to accept his words and let them wash away the years of self-loathing and internalized blame that had been her constant companions. But belief was difficult when you'd spent your entire life being told a different story, when every person you'd ever known had reinforced the narrative that you were cursed and wrong and fundamentally broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. "What if they're right?" she asked, and her voice cracked on the words. "What if I am cursed? What if accepting your bond kills you the way it killed Marcus and Cain? What if I'm destined to destroy everyone who gets close to me? What if the moon goddess marked me not as your mate, but as a warning, a test to see if you're smart enough to stay away from the girl who brings death wherever she goes?" The confession poured out of her like poison she'd been holding inside, and she watched Theron's expression shift from patient understanding to something fiercer, something that looked almost like anger. But she realized after a moment was directed not at her, but at everyone who'd ever made her believe such terrible things about herself. "Marcus and Cain," Theron said, and his voice had taken on a harder edge now, and Celine looked up at him in surprise, because she'd mentioned those names during her confessions to the wolf, but hadn't expected him to remember or to understand their significance. "They were the men you were matched with before, the ones who died after marking you, and you've carried the guilt of their deaths for years, convinced yourself that you killed them. But did anyone ever tell you the real reason they died? Did anyone ever investigate beyond the surface explanation of heart attacks that were far too convenient and far too similar to be mere coincidence?" Celine shook her head, confused by the direction of his questions, and Theron gestured to the veteran guard who'd spoken earlier. "Captain Aldrich, tell her what our investigators discovered when I asked them to look into the deaths of Marcus Clearwater and Cain Riverstone." The captain stood, pulling a leather folder from inside his armor, and he opened it to reveal papers covered in dense writing, and he began to read in a voice that was clinical and factual, and somehow made the information more devastating than if he'd been emotional about it. Marcus Clearwater and Kane Riverstone both died within hours of marking Celine Silvermist, both from what was initially diagnosed as sudden heart failure. But upon deeper investigation, it was discovered that both men had been dosed with a rare poison called Moonsbane that mimics the symptoms of heart attack when administered in precise quantities. Captain Aldrich read, and Celine felt the world tilt beneath her feet as she tried to process what she was hearing. The poison was traced back to Alpha Garrett Clearwater and his son Dane, who had conspired to eliminate anyone who might successfully mate with Miss Silvermist because they believed her survival and integration into the pack would undermine their authority and perpetuate what they viewed as a curse on their bloodline. And rather than face the moon goddess's wrath for killing an Omega directly, they chose to murder her potential mates and let her believe she was responsible, ensuring she would eventually leave or take her own life out of guilt and despair, thereby solving their problem without technically breaking sacred law. The captain closed the folder and looked at Celine with something like pity in his weathered face. "You didn't kill those men, my lady. They were murdered by wolves who wanted you gone, but were too cowardly to admit their prejudice openly. And you've carried false guilt for crimes you didn't commit. And I'm sorrier than I can express that you suffered under that burden for so long." The revelation hit Celine like a physical blow, and she felt her knees give out completely. But before she could hit the ground, Theron was there, catching her and holding her against his chest, while she struggled to breathe through the shock and horror and strange, disorienting relief that came with knowing she hadn't killed anyone, that the curse she'd believed defined her entire existence had been manufactured by cruel wolves who'd wanted her gone. "They murdered them," she heard herself saying, and her voice sounded distant and strange. "They murdered Marcus and Kane, and let me think I was the killer. Let me believe I was cursed. Let me carry that guilt for years while they knew the truth. And I left. I banished myself. I spent 2 years wandering alone because I thought I was too dangerous to be around other people, because I thought anyone who got close to me would die. And it was all a lie. All of it. Everything I believed about myself was built on a foundation of deliberate cruelty and manipulation." She was crying now, great racking sobs that shook her entire body. But they weren't entirely tears of grief. There was something else mixed in, something that felt like rage at the injustice of what had been done to her. Rage at the time she'd lost, the connections she'd denied herself, the life she could have lived if she hadn't been convinced she was a walking curse. Theron held her through the storm of emotions, one hand stroking her silver hair while he murmured words of comfort that Celine couldn't quite hear over the sound of her own crying. And eventually, when the tears finally subsided into exhausted hiccups, she found herself pulling back just enough to look up at his face, to see the way he was looking at her with such tender concern that it made her heart ache in ways that had nothing to do with pain. "You came back for me," she said, and it wasn't a question but a statement of wonder, a recognition of the impossible truth that this powerful king had returned to her cottage with an army not to punish or intimidate, but to claim her, to offer her everything she'd been denied her entire life. "You could have just sent guards to check on me, could have sent a message of thanks and moved on with your life, but you came yourself. You brought your elite warriors, and you're standing here asking me to be your mate even though you know everything about me now, all my weaknesses and fears and pathetic confessions about loneliness." Theron's hand cupped her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so large and powerful, and his thumb brushed away the tears that were still sliding down her pale cheeks. I came back because I had to, because the mate bond was pulling at me every moment I was away from you, because I spent those 5 days falling in love with your voice and your kindness and your unshakable compassion, even in the face of your own suffering. And when I left, it felt like tearing my own heart out. And I knew I couldn't live without you, couldn't rule my kingdom or fulfill my duties or find any meaning in my existence if I didn't at least try to convince you to give me a chance, to give us a chance. The decision crystallized in Celine's mind with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, and she realized that she was standing at a crossroads where one path led back to her lonely cottage and her isolation and her slow fade into nothingness, while the other path led toward something she'd never dared to hope for, toward connection and purpose and the possibility of building a life that mattered. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice steady despite the fear that was still coiled in her chest. "I'm terrified of failing you, of not being good enough to be a queen, of disappointing an entire kingdom that deserves better than a homeless Omega with no training in politics or leadership. But I'm more terrified of watching you walk away and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to say yes." She took a deep breath that felt like it was pulling courage up from the very core of her being. "So yes, I'll come with you. I'll accept the mate bond. I'll try to be your Luna and your queen and whatever else you need me to be. Not because I think I'm worthy of it, but because you've somehow convinced me that maybe, just maybe, I could learn to be. And because you listened to all my broken pieces and decided you wanted them anyway, and that's more than anyone has ever offered me before." The smile that spread across Theron's face was radiant enough to rival the sun, and he pulled her close and kissed her with a gentleness that quickly deepened into something more passionate, more desperate, and Celine felt the mate bond flare between them like lightning, bright and hot and undeniable, and it was nothing like the forced connections she'd experienced before. This was right and perfect, and felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and glowing with the bond's energy, Theron rested his forehead against hers and spoke words that Selene knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "You saved me before you knew my name or my title. You gave everything you had when you had nothing. You showed me what true strength looks like, and I promise you that I will spend every day of my life proving that you made the right choice, proving that you're valued and cherished and necessary, not just to me, but to a kingdom that desperately needs someone with your compassion and your wisdom leading beside me." The guards rose from their positions and began setting up a camp around the cottage with military efficiency, and Captain Aldrich approached with supplies and warm clothes and food that made Celine's empty stomach clench with hunger. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to accept help without shame, allowed herself to be cared for by people who genuinely seemed to want her well-being. The journey to the Silverwood Kingdom took a week, and during that time, Theron was endlessly patient and respectful, never pushing Celine beyond her comfort level, answering her thousands of questions about court life and politics with a thoroughness that suggested he genuinely valued her input rather than simply humoring her concerns. And slowly, day by day, Celine began to believe that maybe this wasn't a dream that would shatter. Maybe this was actually her new reality. They talked constantly during the journey, Theron sharing stories about his own struggles with loneliness and the burden of ruling alone, while Celine opened up about her years of wandering and the small kindnesses that had kept her going when she'd wanted to give up. And with each conversation, the bond between them strengthened, weaving their souls together in ways that felt both ancient and entirely new. When they finally arrived at the Silverwood Palace, a magnificent structure of silver stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Selene was overwhelmed by the crowds that had gathered to welcome their king home and to catch a glimpse of the woman he'd claimed as his mate. And she wanted to shrink back into the shadows the way she always had. But Theron took her hand and held it firmly, anchoring her to the present moment. And when he presented her to his people as Luna Selene, their future queen, the roar of approval that rose from the assembled wolves made tears spring to her eyes because they were cheering for her, accepting her, welcoming her in a way no pack ever had before. The mate ceremony was held under the full moon 3 weeks later, after Selene had been given time to adjust to palace life and to work with the healers and to discover that her skills with herbs and her natural empathy made her exceptional at tending to the sick and wounded. And she'd found her purpose in those healing wards, found a way to contribute that felt meaningful and important. And the people had started to love her, not because she was their king's mate, but because she genuinely cared about their well-being. Standing under the moon with Theron beside her and the entire kingdom watching, Selene spoke vows that came from her heart rather than from tradition, promising to choose him every day, not because fate demanded it, but because she wanted to, because he'd shown her that love wasn't about possession or obligation, but about partnership and respect, and the daily decision to value someone else's happiness as much as your own. When Theron marked her, his teeth sinking gently into her neck, the mate bond exploded between them with such intensity that silver light actually erupted from the point of connection, visible to every witness, and the kingdom erupted in celebration because they recognized it as a sign from the moon goddess herself that this was a true mating, a perfect pairing, a union blessed by divine will. And when Selene marked Theron in return, creating the rare double bond that only true mates could share, she felt something inside her settle and heal, felt the wounds of her past finally beginning to close. 5 years passed in what felt like both a lifetime and a moment, and Selene transformed from the frightened, rejected Omega into a confident Luna who ruled beside Theron with wisdom and compassion, who revolutionized the kingdom's healing practices and established programs to help orphans and outcasts find their place in society, who became known throughout the territories as the Silver Luna, the queen who never forgot what it felt like to be unwanted, and who made sure no one in her kingdom would ever feel that way again. She and Theron had 3 children, all blessed with silver hair and silver blue eyes, and watching them grow up loved and accepted and celebrated for their differences rather than punished for them, healed something in Selene that she hadn't known was still broken. And she finally understood that her appearance had never been a curse, but rather a mark that had been waiting for the right person to recognize and value it. When a young Omega named Kira came to the palace seeking help, terrified and convinced she was cursed because of her white hair and her rejection by her pack, Selene took her hands and told her the story of feeding a starving wolf in an abandoned cottage, of believing she was worthless until someone showed her otherwise, and she watched hope bloom in the girl's eyes the way it had once bloomed in her own, and she knew that this was her true purpose, not just ruling a kingdom, but showing others who felt lost and broken that they were actually found and whole. They just hadn't met the right people yet. Standing on the palace balcony with Theron beside her and their children playing in the gardens below, where silver moonflowers bloomed year-round as a symbol of their love, Selene reflected on how drastically her life had changed from that cold autumn evening when she'd heard scratching at her door and made the choice to open it despite her fear. She'd learned that curses were sometimes blessings in disguise, that the things that made her different were the things that made her extraordinary. that true strength wasn't about being hard or ruthless, but about remaining kind in a cruel world, about choosing compassion over self-preservation even when it hurt, about believing that you deserved good things even when everyone had told you otherwise. Do you ever regret it? Theron asked softly, pulling her close against his side. Opening that door, saving a dying wolf, accepting a mate bond that turned your entire life upside down? Celine smiled and tilted her face up to kiss him, tasting love and home and future in that simple touch. Never, she said with absolute conviction. That moment was the first day of my real life, the day I stopped merely surviving and started actually living. And everything that came after, all the challenges and changes and moments of doubt, they were all worth it because they led me here. To you, to our family, to this life I never dared to dream I could have. And as the sun set over the Silverwood Kingdom, painting the sky in shades of silver and gold, Celine knew with complete certainty that sometimes the most important moments in life happen when you're just trying to help someone in need, when you choose kindness without expecting anything in return, when you open your door to a stranger and discover that you've actually been opening your door to your destiny, and that the girl who everyone said was cursed had actually been blessed all along. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to bloom. So if you enjoyed this story of Celine and Theron, of the rejected Omega who fed a starving wolf and discovered she was actually saving a king who would become her mate and transform her from a wandering outcast into a beloved queen, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, because your feedback and engagement mean everything to content creators like me, who pour their hearts into these stories. Tell me what resonated with you about Celine's journey, whether you related to her feelings of rejection and isolation, whether Theron's patient devotion made your heart flutter the way it made mine flutter while writing it, and what other kinds of werewolf romance stories you'd like to see next, because I'm always looking for inspiration and your suggestions help guide the content I create. Please subscribe to the channel so you never miss future stories featuring powerful alphas and resilient omegas and fated mates who overcome impossible odds to find their happily ever after, and hit that notification bell so you'll be alerted the moment I upload a new tale of supernatural romance and redemption. Your support through likes and comments and subscriptions is what allows me to continue writing these stories, continue exploring themes of acceptance and belonging, and the transformative power of love. And I'm so grateful to each and every person who takes the time to read these words and connect with these characters and share this journey with me. Thank you for reading about Celine and Theron. Thank you for believing in stories where the outcast finds their home and the broken discover they were actually whole all along. And I'll see you in the next story, where we'll explore another corner of this supernatural world and another pair of souls destined to find each other against all odds.